Part 3. Militarization of Asia and the Pacific. The year 2018 marked a remarkable yet unheralded shift in Canadian foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific. In that year, the Canadian government deployed Canadian Armed Forces aircraft and frigates to East Asia in Operation Neon. Additional military commitments followed, and today the Canadian Armed Forces is engaged in active deployments around Korea and the South China Sea, frequently leading to confrontations with People's Republic of China forces. Does this new Canadian military profile in East Asia signal a departure from previous Canadian policy and the beginning of a new era of Canadian military intervention in the region? If so, this would constitute a major change that has taken place with little public consultation regarding the potential risks and ramifications. In this section, we examine the origins of the changes in Canada's military profile and the correlation with the beginning of a crisis in Canada-China relations in 2018, which subsequently ballooned into Canada's China Panic. Tracking the motives, actions, and resistance to the changes that have occurred over the past 5 years, we provide a provisional interpretation for what has transpired and suggest that the government has aligned the Canadian Armed Forces with the U.S.-led military encirclement of China. The significance in this alignment lies in the legitimacy it lends to U.S. operations in the region. And this shift has historical implications, because it marks the end of a Canadian policy of avoiding military confrontation in the Pacific since the withdrawal of Canadian troops from Korea in 1957. The Vancouver Foreign Ministers Meeting, January 2018. In January 2018, Canadian and U.S. Foreign Ministers Chrystia Freeland and Rex Tillerson hosted the Vancouver Foreign Ministers Meeting on Security and Stability on the Korean Peninsula. The session brought together representatives of the allied nations that fought in the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, excluding China, Russia, and North Korea, despite the new peace-building initiatives announced by North and South Korea on the Korean Peninsula.
And unfortunately, what we've seen in the most recent incidents, on 2 occasions, the actions of People's Republic of China fighter jets were deemed to be significantly unsafe. As outlined in our Indo-Pacific strategy, we're going to continue to step up our forces in that region.
Defense Minister Bill Blair on recent confrontations in East Asia. Global Affairs Canada stated that the purpose of the jointly sponsored meeting was to demonstrate solidarity in opposition to North Korea's dangerous and illegal actions, and to work together to strengthen diplomatic efforts toward a secure, prosperous, and denuclearized Korean Peninsula. To this end, foreign ministers will discuss ways to increase the effectiveness of the global sanctions regime in support of a rules-based international order. Freeland stated that a diplomatic solution was both essential and possible. The fact that U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis accompanied Tillerson to the conference, however, underscored the U.S. iron fist in Canada's velvet glove. Contrary to Freeland's emphasis on diplomatic solutions, a Reuters report at the time suggested that the summit would probe how to boost maritime security around North Korea and options to interdict ships carrying prohibited goods in violation of sanctions. Given its years of deep involvement in the effort to get North Korea to end its nuclear program, the People's Republic of China was irate and expressed its irritation publicly.
Since this meeting does not have legitimacy or representativeness, China has opposed the meeting from the very beginning.
Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang stated,
while countries are committed to finding a proper solution for the peaceful settlement of the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue, some parties hold such a meeting in the name of the so-called United Nations Command during the Cold War era. We do not know what the purpose of convening such a meeting is.
After the summit, most commentators professed confusion regarding the goals and outcome of the meeting. One pointed out,
inexplicably, the event didn't include global powers Russia or China, North Korea's most influential neighbors. Instead, countries such as Greece, Belgium, Colombia, and Luxembourg were asked to attend, as if any of them have the clout to help resolve the Korean conflict. The absence of China was particularly perplexing.
A UBC analyst commented that,
our interests in being seen as a middle power in this circumstance are not advanced by being seen as an instrument of a U.S. agenda, advocating a one-note, hardline extreme pressure strategy. And I think particularly in convening meetings in which key players are not involved.
The confusion and concern expressed in these statements derive from what seemed like a sudden and inexplicable shift from cooperation and engagement with China and Russia to deal with the nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, one of exclusion and confrontation. The Canadian government soon made clear that it was moving towards further military intervention in the sensitive area, a process that has continued ever since. Canada's military deploys to the Pacific. The upshot from the Vancouver summit materialized in April 2018, when Chrystia Freeland announced that Canada would deploy military forces off Korea to enforce sanctions.
Canada has deployed a Canadian Armed Forces Maritime Patrol aircraft in the region to assist in this effort, in addition to assets being provided by the United States and the United Kingdom.
In the 4 years since this announcement, Canada has extended its military presence in the Asia-Pacific. According to the Canadian Armed Forces, this escalating presence aims at enforcing sanctions against North Korea, reinforcing partnerships with military allies, or reinforcing the rules-based international order. A concept that has been criticized as departing from the centrality of UN principles and international law. Nevertheless, Canada has persisted in a more assertive posture in the Asia-Pacific in 3 distinct areas of operations. Operation Neon. This new forward military positioning saw Canadian naval vessels, as well as CP-140 Aurora surveillance aircraft based in Okinawa, operating over 1,000 kilometers south of Japan beginning in 2018. Over the next 5 years, 9 distinct deployments of frigates have taken place, assisted by supply ship Asterix and CP-140 Aurora. The Canadian Armed Forces has committed to maintaining these operations into 2026. In 2018, Chief of the Defense Staff, General Wayne Eyre, was appointed Deputy Commander of the United Nations Command in the Republic of Korea, and, according to a 2023 announcement by the Minister of Defense, the next Deputy Commander will also be a Canadian officer. News reports indicate that the operations that began in 2018 immediately led to confrontation with Chinese air forces off the coast of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. These skirmishes are often referred to as buzzing. As a result, in 2022, the Canadian Armed Forces declared that the People's Liberation Army Air Force was putting Royal Canadian Air Force personnel at risk, an accusation denied by the PRC. Justin Trudeau repeated the complaint in June the following year. Canada's Operation Neon seems to have exacerbated tensions in the region and deserves critical assessment. However, PRC Canadian confrontations have not been restricted to Operation Neon. Operation Projection, Indo-Pacific. In early November 2023, the CBC reported that the People's Republic of China jets had buzzed a CH-148 Cyclone helicopter operating off His Majesty's Canadian ship Ottawa, putting the crews at risk, according to Canada's Minister of Defence. The frigate and helicopter were operating in the South China Sea. A spokesperson for the People's Republic of China Defense Ministry responded, stating that the helicopter had approached the Chinese airspace in the Jisha Islands recently with unidentified intentions, refused to respond to warnings, and had taken evasive actions. What is notable about this particular incident is its location. The skirmish took place not near Korea but in the South China Sea. In 2018, the Canadian government decided to begin conducting forward naval presence operations in the region, as well as conduct cooperative deployments and participate in international naval exercises with partner nations. These operations aim to promote peace and stability in support of the rules-based international order. Operation Projection is distinct from Operation Neon in both its mandate and its area of operations, although overlapping at times. The first deployment began in April 2018, with the dispatch of His Majesty's Canadian ship Vancouver to participate in the U.S.-led Pacific Partnership, followed by a series of annual dispatches for military exercises with the U.S. forces, often including support for Operation Neon. News reports capture the tenor of these exercises. In September 2023, Canada's CBC News, the national broadcast a live report from aboard His Majesty's Canadian ship Ottawa, a Canadian frigate that was about to join us and Japanese naval vessels to sail through the Taiwan Straits, heavily shadowed by PRC maritime forces. The reporter suggested that what was taking place on the water was a microcosm for deteriorating relations between China and both Canada and the United States. The news report highlighted this deterioration by recalling that 6 years earlier, in May 2017, the same warship had arrived in Shanghai to a warm welcome from the People's Republic of China's maritime forces. In 2021, the Canadian Navy participated in a U.S.-led naval exercise, Pacific Crown, off Okinawa. Labeled a stark warning to China, the wargames brought together 3 Western aircraft carrier strike groups and a Japanese helicopter carrier that's now able to launch fast stealth fighters. The commander of the United Kingdom Carrier Strike Group, Steve Morehouse, told the reporter,
"It's an important message for those here that nations like ourselves really do believe in the freedom of navigation, in the freedom of trade, and really are alarmed at the militarization of the area."
Western allies can work seamlessly together, he said. In August 2022, 2 Canadian warships, His Majesty's Canadian ship Vancouver and His Majesty's Canadian ship Winnipeg, departed Esquimalt Naval Base, heading for San Diego, and then Hawaii to participate in the Rim of the Pacific War maneuvers scheduled from June 29 to August 4. Just as the Canadian warships were departing Esquimalt, activists in Hawaii gathered at Kailua, near the Marine Corps Air Station on Kaneohe Bay, to protest the impending visit of the Rim of the Pacific warships, including Canada. The U.S. Pacific Fleet reported that the naval operations ended on August 4.
26 nations, 38 surface ships, 3 submarines, 9 national land forces, more than 30 unmanned systems, approximately 170 aircraft, and over 25,000 personnel participated in the 28th edition of the biennial Rim of the Pacific.
The goal was to enhance naval collaboration for the U.S. proposed agenda of a free and open Indo-Pacific. For the first time, Canadian Armed Forces even dispatched the frigate His Majesty's Canadian ship Montreal from its Halifax port on the Atlantic to participate in the Pacific War Game. Canada's Operation Neon, Operation Projection, and its 2022 Rim of the Pacific participation constitute a new military posture in the Pacific for Canada and pose important questions. It has meant that the Canadian Armed Forces is now stationing its forces at both the U.S.-controlled Kadena Air Base, as well as at its naval station, White Beach, on Okinawa, an island chain doubly colonized by Japan and an island sacrifice zone, according to Asian American scholar Jody Kim. Okinawans voiced their concerns in a recent Global Television News report. Has the Canada become complicit in the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous Okinawans who, for the past 75 years, have continuously fought to regain their lands taken by the U.S. military for military purposes? Is Canadian in contravention of Global Affairs Canada's commitment to enable Indigenous peoples' representation and meaningful engagement in international discussions and decisions affecting them? In addition, the Canadian Armed Forces' view that Operation Neon is a United Nations-sponsored operation is strongly contested. Certainly, the United Nations has imposed sanctions against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, but there is no United Nations mission specifically designated to enforce these sanctions. Operation Neon is instead considered a part of a U.S.-led attempt to utilize the United Nations command moniker from the Korean War as a justification for its military enforcement of sanctions. It's essential to note that this move has never received formal United Nations approval. The fact that the United Nations command has not been formally dissolved serves as a testament only to the ongoing tragedy that both North and South Korea have endured since their annexation by Japan in 1910. Context and implications. Peggy Mason, director of the Rideau Institute and former Canadian ambassador on disarmament, pointed out that
we face a daily barrage of material in the media demonizing China at every turn.
Drawing on Jeffrey Sachs, she reminded readers that
the only country with a defense strategy calling for global dominance is the United States of America.
She then highlighted Sachs' comparison of military deployment.
The U.S. has around 800 overseas military bases, while China has just one small naval base in Djibouti.
For the most part, however, the deployment of Canadian Armed Forces to East Asia has occurred without much discussion or debate in Canada. As the skirmishes with the People's Republic of China military forces increase, the ramifications are coming home, suggesting that it is worth taking a closer look at the policy shift that has taken place. Canada's military capacity in the Pacific remains minor compared to other US allies such as Japan or even Australia. The significance of the recent military deployments and budget increases for the Canadian Armed Forces in the Asia-Pacific lies elsewhere. A visit to Ottawa by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in August 2019 is suggestive. Canadian Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland stated in the press conference afterwards that Canada and the U.S. were indispensable allies in North American Aerospace Defense Command and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, quickly adding,
Today, alongside our American allies, Canadian Armed Forces ships and maritime patrol aircraft are deployed under Operation Neon to ensure sanctions are imposed against North Korea. And the deputy commander of the United Nations force in Korea is a Canadian.
Pompeo replied.
I thank them profusely for their solidarity with the United States on a wide range of issues. Chrystia mentioned many of them, but North Korea and Venezuela in particular. Canada has been a fantastic partner.
Pompeo's linking Canada's support regarding North Korea to Canadian support for Venezuela reflects the way in which the U.S. harnesses Canadian actions to justify its own transgressions, which, in the case of Venezuela, was a gross example of both U.S. and Canadian foreign interference in that country. Is this also happening in the Asia-Pacific? Is the deployment of the Canadian Armed Forces to the Asia-Pacific a public commitment on the part of the Canadian government to reinforce the U.S. strategy of military containment of China, developed by the Trump administration and continued by the Biden administration? The U.S. administration unleashed its anti-China hawks, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and others, who collectively designated the People's Republic of China as its main adversary in the world. As discussed in Part 1, both the 2018 National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy focused on China, and the renaming of the Asia-Pacific as the Indo-Pacific reflected its hopes to recruit India in the encirclement of China. By 2019, the China threat had become dogma, with the Indo-Pacific defined as the military's priority theater according to the U.S. Defense Department's Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. The hardline stance against China was then sustained and even intensified by the Biden administration when it came to power in 2021 and announced new measures, including the signing of Australia, United Kingdom, United States, a trilateral military pact for Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines to deploy against China. A move that caused a furor, as it involved Australia tearing up a multi-billion-dollar contract with France. Establishing the CAUT, a military consultative pact among the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan to encircle China, creating a new... As a result, what the U.S. today calls its Indo-Pacific Command includes approximately 375,000 U.S. military and civilian personnel, including the U.S. Pacific Fleet with approximately 200 ships, including 5 aircraft carrier strike groups, nearly 1,100 aircraft, and more than 130,000 sailors and civilians. Marine Corps Forces. Pacific comprises 2 Marine Expeditionary Forces and about 86,000 personnel and 640 aircraft. U.S. Pacific Air Forces include approximately 46,000 airmen and civilians and more than 420 aircraft. U.S. Army Pacific has approximately 106,000 personnel, plus over 300 aircraft and 5 watercraft, along with more than 1,200 special operations personnel. Department of Defense civilian employees in the Indo-Pacific Command Area of Responsibility number, about 38,000. This level of lethality represents an ongoing threat to peace in the Pacific. Canada's defense establishment anticipated and then fully embraced augmenting the U.S. military presence in the Pacific. By October 2022, Canada's Chief of Defense Staff Wayne Eyre declared, "Russia and China are not just looking at regime survival but regime expansion. They consider themselves to be at war with the West," he said. "They strive to destroy the social cohesion of liberal democracies and the credibility of our own institutions to ensure our model of government is seen as a failure." Canadian Armed Forces' military tilt toward the Pacific was reinforced in Canada's Indo-Pacific Strategy released in late 2022. "We are not just going to engage the Indo-Pacific. We are going to lead," stated Canada's foreign minister in announcing the new strategy. China is identified as an increasingly disruptive global power that Canada would challenge whenever necessary and only cooperate with, if we must. It allocated nearly $500 million to increase the Canadian military's presence in the Asia-Pacific, and more than $227 million to bolster its national security agencies, including Canadian Security Intelligence Service, the Canadian Securities Exchange, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and Canada Border Services Agency, in the region. This funding reflects an expanded role for the Five Eyes intelligence network in Asia and the Pacific. Historicizing the shift. When we historicize Canada's recent military tilt into the Pacific, it suggests that what we are witnessing is, in fact, a departure from previous Canadian military policy in Asia and the Pacific. Canadian Armed Forces participated in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. However, the 1953 armistice in Korea, followed by the 1954 Geneva Accords, led to the withdrawal of all Canadian troops from Korea by 1957. In 1955, when the U.S. government promoted the idea of a North Atlantic Treaty Organization-type alliance for Asia, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, Canadian reaction was negative, and it declined to participate. Since then, the Canadian government has avoided military deployments to Asia, except for minimal participation with its allies or as part of peacekeeping missions, such as the International Commissions for Supervision and Control for Indochina. Canada's participation in the International Commissions for Supervision and Control was one of the starting points for Canada's reputation as a peacekeeper, allowing it to refrain from sending troops alongside the US, UK, Australia, and New Zealand contingents fighting in Vietnam. Ironically, it was the People's Republic of China, along with India, that nominated Canada to the Commission in 1954. For Lester Pearson and others, the ostensible and practical reason to avoid participation in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization or deploying military forces to Asia and the Pacific was that they saw the deployment of armed forces to Asia as possibly detracting from Canada's military commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There was an additional reason, however. Pearson and others, including John Holmes, whom the North Atlantic Treaty Organization hounded out of Canada's Foreign Affairs Department because he was gay, had begun to see the need for a degree of Canadian autonomy as a counterweight to its dependence on the United States. This gave rise to theories of Canada as a middle power, which meant that Canada could, when we want, differ from our major allies and do not belong to any bloc. The advent of Pierre Trudeau to the leadership of the Liberal government in 1968 saw further shifts, including, finally, recognition of the People's Republic of China and a more active but peaceful foreign policy for Canada in Asia and the Pacific. Some scholars and officials in Canadian foreign policy communities continue to aspire to this notion, while others promote closer integration with the U.S. empire. Canada's new military profile in the Asia-Pacific is a definite step towards tighter military integration with the U.S. in Asia and the Pacific, a de facto reversal of a policy to resist military intervention represented by Canada's refusal to join in Southeast Asia Treaty or additionally, aligning the Canadian armed forces with the U.S. military in the Pacific suggests that Canada's aspirations as a middle power hold little relevance to. Instead, the Canadian government is again taking its lead from the Five Eyes. The states in the Five Eyes, the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, constituted a historically powerful bloc in Asia and the Pacific, often allying with others, including Japan, South Korea, and some Southeast Asian nations to assure U.S. power in the Pacific. Understanding the genealogy of this bloc reveals insights into the politics of race and empire in the region. The Five Eyes alliance came together in the 1948 to 52 period initially as an intelligence-sharing arrangement. It evolved out of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain racializing appeal at Fulton, Missouri, in 1946, where he called for a fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples to enforce world peace. Aimed at the rising forces of decolonization, Churchill's speech was a paternalistic call to arms.
This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire in the United States. If the population of the English-speaking Commonwealth be added to that of the United States, with all that such cooperation implies in the air, on the sea, all over the globe, and in science and industry, and in moral force, there will be no quivering, precarious balance of power to offer its temptation to ambition or adventure.
Appealing for unity of the Anglosphere, Churchill was, in fact, calling for the strengthening of a US-UK-centered alliance to perpetuate liberal imperial power and to assure the continuation of global white supremacy. One of the outcomes of this appeal was the creation of the Five Eyes alliance among the English-speaking states, which was to become both a political and intelligence bloc. Its racial origins still echo today in the comment by retired Canadian Brigadier General James Cox that the Five Eyes have an affinity strengthened by their common Anglo-Saxon culture. In the immediate aftermath of the Pacific War, the Five Eyes alliance was instrumental in constructing what Japanese-American historian Akira Irie described as the San Francisco system. Named after the city that hosted the signing of the peace treaty with Japan in 1951, Irie described what emerged between 1945 and 1954.
The rearmament of Japan, continued presence of American forces in Japan, their military alliance, and the retention by the United States of Okinawa and the Bonin Islands. In return, the United States would remove all restrictions on Japan's economic affairs and renounce the right to demand reparations and war indemnities. Here was a program for turning Japan from a conquered and occupied country into a military ally.
The U.S. also supported military alliances between New Zealand and Australia and signed pacts with the Philippines, South Korea, and Taiwan, as well as Japan. The U.S. was able to mobilize the Five Eyes bloc to support its intervention in Korea and to assure its domination of the Peace Treaty Conference in San Francisco, which was effectively a peace treaty without Asia. Most countries that had suffered from Japanese imperialism were either excluded or boycotted the conference or refused to ratify the treaty. Many of the territorial disputes in East Asia currently in the news date from this unjust treaty. The Five Eyes, however, provided the legitimacy for the war in Korea, the peace treaty, and the San Francisco system that emerged at the time. While most commentators frame this as part of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and later China, applied to Asia, the term is entirely Eurocentric and misleading. Assured of support among its Five Eyes allies, U.S. hegemony in the Pacific was predicated on stopping decolonization and blocking national liberation movements in Indochina, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Burma, and elsewhere unless they adhered to US control. Those who pursued an independent course were subsequently considered offshoots of Soviet expansionism, a reductionist absurdity rife with racist overtones. The results were the Korean War and Vietnam Wars, with their horrendous loss of life. Kent Wong, director of the University of California Labor Center and founding director of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, points out that, historically, anti-Asian violence in the United States is directly related to U.S. foreign policy in Asia. During the Vietnam War, Asian people were dehumanized. The brutal massacre of Vietnamese women and children in My Lai, Vietnam, was conducted by U.S. soldiers who viewed the Vietnamese people as less than human. The U.S. military used napalm, Agent Orange, anti-personnel weapons, and massive bombings to target and kill millions of civilians, all justified through the lens of white supremacy and anti-communism. Today, that violence has reemerged as successive U.S. administrations brandish an inflated China threat, seeking out eternal enemies to justify their global wars. This rebranding of the Yellow Peril reflects the persistence and malleability of racist perceptions of Asia. These warnings echo those by Yuan Paowu, Xiaobei Chen, and others cited earlier in this paper. Unfortunately, the recasting of the Canadian presence in Asia as a military one, in the midst of Canada's China panic, returns us to an era rife with the dangers of racism, anti-communism, and war. Given this context, Canada's justification for its intervention, that it is conducting United Nations operations near Korea or enforcing the rules-based international order, deserves much closer scrutiny. Australian historians Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds point out in Drawing the Global Color Line that the US-UK-Australia invasion of Iraq in 2003 recapitulates the Anglo-Saxon solidarity of earlier times with devastating consequences. Is Canada now in the process of doing in Asia what we wisely avoided doing in Iraq in 2003? Ongoing pressures to conform to the demands of the U.S. empire in the Pacific derive to some extent from the similarities between Canada and the United States as settler colonies. Of the Five Eyes, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are settler offshoots from their progenitor, the United Kingdom. The westward expansion across the Pacific was predicated, first and foremost, on the dispossession of indigenous peoples in these settler colonies. Subsequent expansion across the Pacific and into Asia forced an accommodation between the imperial powers. The smaller settler states of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have not always adhered to the policies of the UK-US axis. However, Canada's China panic today, with its ongoing deployment of Canadian forces to East Asia, suggests that the era of Canada searching for autonomy from the US is no longer on the agenda, particularly given the new Democratic Party's hostility towards China. Are we now witnessing Canada's evolution into a sentinel state for the United States? In an increasingly polarized world, millions in the streets of both the global North and South are aligning themselves against the forces of what some call colonial racial capitalism. Those of us on the territories called Canada are increasingly obliged to begin difficult conversations and make critical decisions as we face the existential crises of war and environmental degradation that imperil planetary survival. May we do so in a way that unifies the many and isolates the forces of empire and war.